Welcome, you curious mind, to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into a topic that feels, well, incredibly current, almost like it just popped up everywhere, populism. But our sources suggest this isn't really some sudden explosion. It's actually been bubbling away for a long, long time.
Exactly. We're going to break down a really important analysis by Donny Roderick. It's called Populism and the Economics of Globalization.
hmm
And his paper makes this fascinating, maybe slightly unsettling argument that the rise of populism, especially, in its more recent forms, wasn't just predictable. It was maybe almost inevitable given the sort of underlying economic currents of globalization.
So our mission today is to pull out the essential insights for you. What are the deep economic roots driving this whole global populist wave? And maybe even more critically, why does it look so different in different places? Sometimes left-wing, sometimes right-wing. It seems to depend on where and how globalization's impacts actually hit. We've boiled down a whole stack of research here, the idea being to give you a real shortcut to being genuinely well-informed on this pretty complex issue. Okay, let's explore this.
Right.
So, first things first. What exactly is populism in this context, in Roderick's view?
Right. He describes it as, well, a pretty loose label, actually. It covers diverse movements, but they all tend to share some core things. An anti-establishment stance, definitely. A claim to speak for the people against, the elites. Also, opposition to standard liberal economics and globalization itself. And often, though, maybe not always, a kind of leaning towards more centralized, maybe authoritarian governance. It's a powerful force, however it shows up.
Okay, and what's really illuminating here is the paper's main claim. Populism isn't some, random recent thing.
Not at all. That's the core assertion. Economic history and theory actually gave us plenty of reasons to expect a pretty big political backlash as economic globalization really took off. Now, sure, other big forces are at play. Technology, these winner-take-all markets where a few huge players dominate. Declining protections for workers. All that's involved and often tangled up with globalization. But the expansion of global trade and finance specifically created these very distinct economic anxieties and, frankly, intense fights over who gets what, distributional struggles.
And it's not just theory, is it? Roderick points to actual history.
Yeah, he shows it's a long recurring pattern. You can look back to the U.S., late 19th century, farmers, workers, miners mobilizing against the gold standard, the big Eastern banks.
Right.
Then you've got Peronism in Latin America in the 30s. And right up to today, or very recently, Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain.
Trump in the U.S.
Exactly. Trump, various anti-Euro parties across Europe. It's a persistent thing. These aren't just isolated blips.
They're like echoes of the same underlying tension.
That's a good way to put it. Manifestations of similar tensions in different times and places.
Okay, this next point is, I think, really interesting because it pushes back against a common idea.
Yeah.
You often hear that opening up to trade, well, it's good for everyone, right?
Yeah.
More choice, cheaper stuff.
Right, the simple win-win story.
But Roderick argues economic theory paints a much more, well, complex picture, maybe even stark.
Precisely. The standard economic models we use, like the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, they don't just say there might be losers when you lower trade barriers. They demonstrate that trade liberalization generically produces losers. That's the term.
Generically, meaning it's baked into the process.
Pretty much. It means when trade opens up, even if the whole economy grows a bit, certain groups, like, say, low-skilled workers in rich countries, their labor is a factor of production, they will see an absolute fall in their real earnings.
Not just relative, but absolute.
Absolute. A direct hit to their purchasing power. And that happens regardless of what they buy. It's fundamental.
Wow, that's a heavy claim, especially given the usual narrative. So losers are almost guaranteed by the theory itself.
According to these standard models, yes.
And it gets even weirder, right? The paper says as globalization goes further, we're taking down smaller and smaller trade barriers. The ratio of wealth redistribution, losses for some, gains for others, compared to the overall economic gain, that ratio actually skyrockets. Can you unpack that?
Yeah, it's a crucial insight. Think of the whole economic pie. Early on, removing big tariffs might make the pie significantly bigger for everyone, huge efficiency gains, even if some slices shrink. But as globalization gets deeper, we're talking about cutting already tiny tariffs. The efficiency gains from doing that are minuscule, almost nothing.
Okay.
But the redistributive effects, the shuffling of wealth from Group A to Group B, that stays pretty significant, roughly linear. So the ratio of wealth shifted around versus the tiny overall gain just goes through the roof.
He calculates this, doesn't he?
He does. It can go from like a factor of 5 when tariffs are high, say 40%, to over 70 when tariffs are down at just 3%.
70 times.
Yeah. It means these later trade deals become much less about growing the pie and much, much more about just slicing it differently, redistributing existing wealth.
That is a massive takeaway. It suggests these advanced trade deals are really distributional fights disguised as efficiency gains. Do we actually see this kind of thing in the real world? Does the data back it
Oh,
up?
absolutely. The evidence is pretty stark. Think about two huge trade shocks for the U.S. First, NAFTA. Studies like one by Jacobian and McLaren found the overall gains for the U.S. economy were tiny. Ramallah said basically zero. Caliendo and Paro calculated maybe 0.08%.
Almost nothing in aggregate.
Exactly. But locally, in affected communities, big absolute losses. They found high school dropouts in heavily NAFTA-impacted areas saw their wages grow 8 percentage points slower from 1990 to 2000 compared to unaffected areas.
8% slower growth.
And in industries that lost the most protection, wages fell by a huge 17 percentage points relative to others.
17%? That's devastating for a family budget.
It really is. Then think about China joining the WTO. Otter, Dorn, and Hansen did landmark work on this. They documented just massive and really persistent disruption in local labor markets. Commuting zones, basically local economies that were heavily exposed to Chinese imports, saw manufacturing jobs fall by about 4.5% more than other areas.
Wow.
And average weekly wages fell about zero point 0.8 percentage points more in those areas. These hits were long-lasting. And critically, the idea that workers would just shift to new jobs in export industries, that often just didn't happen in those same communities.
So the evidence is clear. Tiny, maybe even zero overall gains. But very real, very painful, measurable losses for specific groups and places. This unaddressed economic pain, it just creates fertile ground for populist anger, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It fuels that sense of being left behind.
Now, the textbook solution, right, is if there are losers, you compensate them. Take some gains from the winners, give to the losers. Why hasn't that worked? Why didn't compensation stop this backlash?
Yeah, that's the critical question. The paper points to two massive hurdles: economic problems and political problems. On the economic side, compensation is actually really expensive and, well, distortionary.
Distortionary.
Meaning the process itself creates inefficiencies. Pure lump sum transfers, just handing over cash with no strings, that's impractical. So you need taxes to fund it, complex systems to deliver it. All that creates what economists call dead weight losses.
Okay, what are those exactly?
It's basically economic friction, costs that don't benefit anyone, like the admin cost of the program or taxes discouraging work or investment. Otter and his colleagues estimated an annual deadweight loss of $33 per person just from the extra transfers needed because of the China trade shock. And Entres and others estimated that trade-induced inequality might chew up something like 20% of the potential gains from trade in the first place.
So the very act of trying to compensate creates its own drag on the economy.
Exactly. It makes effective compensation really hard just from an economic standpoint.
And that leads to the political problem.
Which is maybe even bigger. It boils down to credibility and time consistency. Politicians have a big incentive to promise compensation to get a trade deal passed, get the support, or at least quiet the opposition.
Takes up.
But once the deal is done, the political spotlight moves on. The will to actually fund and run these complex, expensive compensation programs, it often just fades away.
Right.
The Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, the TAA in the U.S., it's often cited as a classic example. Historically underfunded, hard for workers to actually access. Plus, the trade agreements themselves often shift bargaining power away from labor unions, making it even harder for them to demand effective compensation later.
It really does sound like a political bait and switch, doesn't it? Promise help, pass the deal, then forget the help.
That's often how it's perceived, yes.
Yeah.
And the paper draws a really interesting contrast here between Europe and the U.S. Well, it describes Europe's big welfare states as basically the flip side of the open economy. Many European nations are smaller, historically more open to trade. They sort of pre-compensated their populations through strong general social safety nets, unemployment benefits, retraining, healthcare.
So compensation was built into the system already.
Exactly. It was embedded in broad social policies, so they didn't need separate fiddly trade adjustment programs as much. The general safety net was there.
But the U.S.?
The U.S. opened up later, especially to low-wage competition, and it did so without putting those kinds of robust, universal social insurance or labor protection systems in place first. The safety net was much weaker.
So Europe built the shock absorbers in first. The
Yeah.
U.S. opened up and then sort of tried to patch things up afterwards, often ineffectively.
That's a fair summary of the argument, yes. It's about the sequencing and the institutional setup.
Okay, this leads to a really fascinating question. Why does trade get such a uniquely bad rap from populists? I mean, automation, technology, that probably causes more job displacement overall, right? But you don't see massive populist campaigns against robots.
That's a super insightful point, and it suggests it's not just about the job loss itself.
So what else is going on?
Well, scapegoating foreigners is definitely part of the populist playbook. We can't deny that. But Roderick argues there's something deeper, a sense of perceived unfairness. International trade sometimes involves competition based on practices that would violate norms or laws at home, things we just wouldn't accept domestically. He calls them blocked exchanges.
Blocked exchanges. Okay, can you give an example? The paper has this thought experiment.
Yeah, the Harry and John example, it clarifies it really well. Imagine two competing firms, Harry's and John's. Harry outcompetes John, John's workers lose their jobs.
Yeah.
Scenario 1, Harry just works harder, is more innovative. Fair enough, most people accept that's how markets work.
Right, competition.
Scenario 2, Harry finds a better, cheaper supplier in, say, Germany. Again, generally accepted as part of global trade.
Still feels within bounds.
Scenario 3, but what if Harry outsources to Bangladesh using a supplier with terrible working conditions? 12-hour shifts, hazardous environment, maybe child labor.
Okay, now it feels different. Problematic.
Exactly. Scenario 4. Or Harry brings workers from Bangladesh to the U.S. on temporary contracts, but pays them below minimum wage, violates safety laws, stuff that's flat out illegal domestically.
Totally unacceptable. Unconscionable.
Right. And the key point is the economic outcome for John's workers losing their jobs might be the same in all scenarios.
But our moral judgment shifts dramatically.
Precisely. It's not just the job loss, it's the feeling that the competition is based on social dumping, using practices abroad that are forbidden or morally wrong at home.
So people empathize more when the loss feels unfair, not just like bad luck in the market.
Exactly. It's about procedural fairness, not just outcomes or inequality levels. People react strongly against competition they see as illegitimate. And this gets worse because modern trade deals have moved towards deep integration. They're not just about tariffs at the border anymore.
They reach behind the border.
Yeah, they try to harmonize domestic regulations, often pushed by specific corporate lobbies. Think pharma wanting stronger patent rules everywhere, or multinationals wanting ISDS, investor-state dispute settlement.
Which lets companies sue governments.
Right, if they think a regulation hurts their profits. These kinds of rules move trade deals away from just boosting efficiency. They create domestic clashes over regulations, sovereignty, and fairness. They really heighten that sense of unfairness.
That makes so much sense.
Yep.
These deals aren't just about widgets crossing borders. They're reshaping how countries govern themselves, often in favor of powerful interests. Okay, we talked a lot about trade in goods, but globalization is also about money moving around capital. How does financial globalization fit into this populist story?
Yeah, that's the other huge piece. And interestingly, economists themselves have always been much more, well, ambivalent about free capital flows compared to free trade in goods. The consensus has really swung back and forth. The paper points this out. After World War II, the consensus was actually for capital controls. Keep finance domestic.
Really?
Yeah. Then by the 90s, it flipped. The IMF, others pushed hard for opening up capital accounts, full convertibility. Then came the Asian financial crisis, then the 2008 global crisis.
And suddenly skepticism returned.
Big time. Capital controls became acceptable again, even advisable in some cases. So the experts themselves have been less sure about this one.
So what are the main dangers or downsides of financial globalization that the paper highlights?
Two big ones stand out in the data. First, a very strong link to financial crises. Reinhardt and Rogoff's work, famous stuff, basically shows that waves of international capital flow and waves of banking crises go hand in hand throughout history.
Like they feed each other?
Almost perfectly correlated. The 2008 crisis in the U.S., the Eurozone debt crisis hitting Greece, Spain, Portugal, both, were massively amplified by cross-border money flows and financial integration.
Okay, so instability is one. What's the other?
Increased inequality. This is striking. Work by Fursari, Longani, and Austri found that opening up the capital account leads to statistically significant, long-lasting drops in the share of national income going to labor.
Labor's slice of the pie shrinks.
It does, and correspondingly, income inequality goes up, measured by the Gini coefficient, the share of income going to the top 1%, top 5%, top 10%.
Why? Is there a clear mechanism like Stolper-Samuelson for trade?
Not exactly the same, but the paper offers a really compelling bargaining-related explanation.
Hmm.
Think about wage negotiations. If capital is mobile, employers have a credible threat they didn't have before,
Mhm.
accept lower wages or worse conditions, or will just move production somewhere cheaper.
The exit option.
Exactly. That fundamentally weakens labor's bargaining power. It also means economic shocks tend to fall harder on labor because labor can't just pick up and move as easily as capital can.
Right.
And it affects taxes too. It's harder for governments to tax mobile capital, so what do? They tend to tax less mobile things more heavily, like labor, through income tax, payroll taxes, and consumption, through VAT or sales taxes.
Which we've seen happen. Corporate tax rates have fallen.
Sharply, yeah. Often by half or more in many advanced countries over the last few decades, while taxes on wages and consumption have generally stayed flat or gone up.
So financial globalization gives capital a huge advantage, a sort of get-out-of-jail-free card for taxes and bargaining
Yeah,
that workers just don't have.
that's the core of the argument. It fundamentally shifts the power balance.
Okay, so we've got the economic anxiety from trade,
Mm.
the instability from finance, the perceived unfairness woven through both.
Hmm.
That explains the demand for populism. But the backlash, as we said, looks different everywhere. Why? Right wing here, left wing there.
Right. This is where Roderick shifts to the supply side of populism. It's about the stories leaders tell, the narratives they offer, and crucially, which cleavages in society are most salient, most easily activated by political entrepreneurs.
Cleavages, like the fault lines in society.
Exactly. Economic anxiety creates the potential energy, the demand, but politicians channel that energy by tapping into specific divides.
So it's not just that populism rises, but how it rises depends on which button the politicians push, cultural or economic.
That's the key distinction the analysis makes. It distinguishes between right-wing populism. This type mobilizes people along ethno-national or cultural lines. The main cleavage is us versus them, where them is often immigrants, refugees, or ethnic minorities.
Okay.
The narrative is about threats to national identity, culture, maybe jobs or public services coming from these outsider groups. This is largely the story in many advanced European countries recently, and with Trump in the U.S. The populist surge has been overwhelmingly right-wing there.
Got it. And left-wing populism.
That mobilizes along income or social class cleavages. The main fault line is the people versus the elites, the 99% versus the 1%. The narrative targets wealthy elites, large corporations, sometimes banks and financiers, blaming them for economic hardship and inequality. This has been the more dominant form in Latin America for decades, think Peronism again. And we saw flashes of it in Europe too, like Syriza in Greece and Podemos in Spain, especially after the Euro crisis hit them hard with austerity, kind of like Latin American experiences.
And the U.S. is interesting because Roderick sees it as a mixed case.
Yeah, precisely because the U.S. got hit by both kinds of shocks strongly. Massive import competition from China hitting manufacturing workers, the huge 2008 financial crisis, and significant immigration acting as a cultural flashpoint.
So the conditions were right for both types.
Exactly. Which helps explain why you saw both a figure like Bernie Sanders running on a left populist platform against inequality and corporate power, and Donald Trump running on a right populist platform emphasizing borders, trade protection, and cultural identity.
That framework really helps make sense of the different flavors we see.
Wow. What an incredibly insightful exploration this has been. It seems clear that populism isn't just some random political weather pattern. It looks much more like a predictable, maybe even, as Roderick suggests, almost inevitable response to the deep economic and social strains from certain kinds of globalization, especially those later hyperglobalization phases. And the huge takeaway seems to be that the costs, the redistribution away from certain groups, the financial instability, that pervasive sense of unfairness, these often loom much larger, at least politically, than the supposed overall gains.
Yeah.
Especially when those costs aren't managed or compensated.
Absolutely. And understanding which kind of populism emerges, right or left, really hinges on how those globalization shocks are actually felt and experienced on the ground.
Right.
And then how political leaders frame them, tapping into either those cultural fault lines or the economic ones. It really forces us to look at global integration with more nuance, doesn't it? Not just good or bad. Definitely. So what does this all mean for us, listening to this, trying to make sense of the world? Roderick concludes, we need a significant rebalancing, right? If we want to keep a reasonably open world economy that actually works for more people.
That's his bottom line. He points out the current model has this fundamental asymmetry. It's been largely designed for and by mobile capital and multinational business, with this kind of implicit hope that benefits will just eventually trickle down to everyone else.
Which clearly hasn't worked out so well for many.
Right. So Roderick leaves us with this provocative thought. What if we flipped it? What if labor, communities, society as a whole were given something like an equal say in writing the rules of globalization? What if global rules were designed to work with national democratic processes, not override them, focused on areas where the gains are genuinely large and widely shared, instead of just pushing relentlessly for deeper integration that mainly benefits specific interests?
Rethinking globalization from the ground up, basically. Building it around fairness and broad benefit, not just corporate efficiency.
Exactly. It's about who gets to set the rules and for whose benefit.
That is definitely something to mull over. A powerful thought to end on. Thank you for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us. We'll explore another fascinating topic next time on The Deep Dive.